Hello and welcome to At the 55, your home for USports football. Me and Tom are back on the mic setting up the first round of playoffs in the OUA and the last week of the regular season in all the other conferences. We'll set up the quarterfinals. We'll talk about the playoff seedings and what's on the horizon for the RSCQ, AUS, and Can West playoffs coming in 2 weeks' time and so much more. But first, Tom, how the heck you doing, brother?
Oh, I'm doing so well, my man. We're finally getting into some playoff action. And right before we get into the playoffs, we see another historic event happening. Central Tech wins a football game for the first time in 7 years with head coach Zach Bader Shammai.
If I sound delirious on the podcast, it's been a long day for this guy. Go Blues. Um, Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that shout out. Getting a start off with the U Sports top 10, though, because, well, let's get into it. Let's have a quick discussion on it because still reigning supreme at the top are the Laurier Golden Hawks, followed by the Laval Rouge or Western at 3, Saskatchewan at 4, Montreal at 5, St. Mary's at 6, Regina at 7, Queens at 8, Windsor at 9, St. FX at 10 with I believe it's Manitoba trailing at 11th, short behind, just behind Santa Fe. Santa Fe with 12 points and Manitoba with 11. Tom, I think for most folks, the question is, was a one seed drop enough for what Western put on display or didn't put on display last week against Laurier? I'm often of the perspective of, you don't want to overreact to one thing, but I'm also the guy that at the midway point of the season had them at fifth to begin with. Obviously, Sask's still on the winning streak, but no Anton, and I don't know if that factors into people's minds when you say ranking these teams and you're saying, hey, 6-1's nice, Sask's on a roll, but they're obviously limited by that. Montreal losing to Laval, obviously, Laval has been as good as anyone so far. But what do you make of really? Because I really imagine it's the Western piece that's kind of at the top of most people's minds as far as whether they dropped far enough.
Yeah, that's obviously the thing that sticks out the most glaringly. To me, that Western team should be at number 5 right now. With how they played, the fact that both of the quarterbacks that went in on that game did not finish with completion percentages over 50%. And it was a rough day for the Mustangs, and it truly was. And I think that if you're looking at this across the board with how good that Saskatchewan Husky team looks, with Seth Hundeby and the rest of that defense humming, and even with Jake Farrell in there at quarterback, they still look solid enough. And I'm being told that Anton is steps away from making his return back into the fold here, and that obviously just raises their level of play. And what Pepe Gonzalez and the rest of that Caravan squad is doing right now, like it should be Laurier at 1, Laval at 2, Sask at 3, Montreal at 4, and Western at 5. And I think that's pretty damn close to where you had everybody when we did that midseason check-in to begin with. So kudos to you.
Well, thank you very much. With Regina, there's an interesting thing to say as well about, without Peltier and seeing kind of what his status is going to be. Obviously, we know that offense revolves around Marshall Erickson and that defense is strong. And, Sirleaf with whoever they got throwing in the ball, still going to put up big yardage. That's an interesting question mark as well. Windsor and Queens, I mean, I'm certain there's a lot of folks at the end of the 401 looking at Windsor sitting behind. You're making a face, Tom. Why are you making a face?
I'm making a face. I'm making a face for the folks sitting down at the end of the 401. How are you going to put Windsor at 9 when they beat Queens in Kingston? And this is the thing. It's one thing if you're like, okay, well, Queens, they traveled down to the 401 and it was a strenuous whatever. Windsor traveled to Kingston after traveling to Ottawa and still picked up the dub in Kingston. They absolutely deserve to be ranked higher than Queens does. I'd put Windsor as high as, 7, to be honest with you. Like, they looked really good.
No, I'm in total agreement with you. And, we'll obviously, finish up this conversation and then start to get into the 3 OUA matchups that we have for the quarterfinals. There's an argument to be made that between the two of those games, both hosting playoff teams, sorry, if both those teams hosting playoff games, I'd say, I think both of them are clearly favored at home. I think Windsor has the more comfortable route right now. Part of that's because they're facing an Ottawa team that's had the wheels come off at the end of the season, and Queens is having a Mac team that's just been getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Yeah, a little injury bit nonetheless. So, there's that factor too, where it just, so again, I think the top five and the bottom five need a little bit of a shakeup. And of course, a lot will be sort of revealed about the AUS come Friday at around 7 p.m. when St. Mary's hosts St. FX. It doesn't feel like there's a four-team gap between those programs, but obviously just the way that the year's been breaking down, I don't have too many qualms with that, and that St. FX loss to Mount Allison still obviously lingers over them.
Yeah, I think everything else for the most part is pretty solid. I mean, I know that this St. Mary's team is really, really looking good. I struggle very much to put them above Regina, where Regina is right now, even with a quarterback battle still going on with Owen and Noah Peltier and everything else. I would put Regina ahead of St. Mary's. There is a bias against the AUS, but I think there is one rightfully so because you haven't made it to the Vanier Cup since 2007. So prove that you can beat a team, and then I'll have no problem putting you above some other teams.
No doubt. Well, let's hop into the action. And of course, we're going to get started with the OUA quarterfinals, starting off in London, Ontario, where the Guelph Griffins are hitting the road looking for a little get back against the Western Mustangs. Tom, these two teams met back on August 31st, 53-33 final for the Ponies. And a game that early on, as you and me were sitting there in the stadium side end zone, or standing, I should say, in the stadium side end zone, watching, seeing Guelph move the ball, and that whole time, as I kept saying, it's well and good. It turned out to be the story in many ways of their season. Of it's all well and good that they're moving the ball, they're getting yardage, but when you keep Western in the game, you give them way too many opportunities. And as it bared out, Western just went off in that second quarter. They put up 28 straight points, I think, or darn near 28 straight points. And it was too large a hill for Guelph to even fathom coming back from. That feels like a lifetime ago. And in many ways, I feel like both teams have had a bit of tumultuous ends to their seasons. Yes, Guelph on the win and Western on the loss, but two teams that I think are still trying to really find themselves. Guelph in large part due to injury. Western's been injured as well, but just the nature of that loss to Laurier, I still think weighs heavy on them. What are your first impressions of this matchup? How much does that earlier season affair factor into your thoughts on this current game?
I think that when you look at this game, I think you get a good sense of how dangerous Western can be when they're given an opportunity. And exactly like you kind of mentioned, when you look at even the score breakdown in the second half, Guelph actually outscores Western 23 points to Western's 22 points. And in the first quarter, they both go for a field goal. But in that second quarter, Western puts up 28 points in one quarter. And you just can't come back from that. That's really what that comes down to. Western is a team that for the entire time that at least I have known them, and they have been captained by one Greg Marshall, the moment that you make a mistake, the moment you give them an opportunity, they will capitalize on it. And so you cannot allow them to do that. That's really where this comes into play. And Guelph, while playing certainly better now than I think they were against Western, still a ton of penalties that this team is dealing with, still a bunch of injuries that this team is dealing with. And so this is going to be, anytime you play Western, it's a very big task, but especially for the Griffins in this kind of spot.
Now, a few things of note going back to that game that I think could put Guelph in an interesting position. Number one, and I think you have some of the answers to sort of the questions I'm going to raise, or sort of the implied questions of these, is that in this game for Guelph, it was still in that period when we didn't see Donovan Malloy play for them. Now, nonetheless, Marshall McRae runs the heck out of the ball. Of course, this is that game where we see Tristan Aboud get hurt. McRae goes in and he gets hurt. Aboud has to limp back into the game. And no doubt that played a large part onto their season, but no Donovan Malloy on the one hand. On the other hand, for Western, a day that saw Evan Hill go 13 for 20, 242, and 2 touchdowns, while also seeing Jack Kelly get 121 and a touchdown, and Ethan Dolby get 100 on the dot and 2 touchdowns. So I say all that in saying that for Guelph, no Donovan Malloy, and the sort of implied question of how effective they are without him, I think you have a stat to share that's pretty remarkable about their successes with and or without him, I should say. And on the other hand, for Guelph, that I'll set you up with here is, or for the Western piece of it against the Guelph defense, that's a pretty nice day for them in the air and on the ground. You know, they get 242 yards in the air, 297 on the ground. That's tough when a team can just do it to you both ways. From that standpoint, the missing Malloy part, and I think we might have a sense of his status for the weekend as well. How impactful is that really for Guelph? And on the other hand, how tough is it when you allow Western to be able to pass and run? And how do you think Guelph might try to plan about against them otherwise?
Yeah, starting off with the Donovan Malloy piece, I was talking with some Guelph coaches earlier, and they pointed out to me when Donovan Malloy has been fully healthy in the 3 years that he has been at Guelph, 3 or 4 years, Guelph has only lost one game. The impact that that young man gives to this entire offense and what he does to just the game in general is cannot be understated. And I think anytime he has the ball in his hands, something special can happen. And even if he doesn't have the ball in his hands, the way that he can help block and come into the fold here as well, he's just a very special player. And Guelph needs all of their guys back that they can get. As far as I know, I do not believe that he will be back in the lineup going into this one. Neither will Caleb Sargent. So the running will go back down to Isaiah Smith and your boy Kanye Nethersall. So we'll see what that 1-2 punch looks like. But defensively here, now I don't think it's any big secret or anything along those lines. The way that Guelph is going to win this game is by stopping the run. You have to be able to stop the run against Western. Every year that's relevant, but especially this year, especially from what we saw with obviously Evan and Jerome's struggles in the game against Laurier, and Rancourt gets in there near the end when the game is pretty much already in hand. So, you want to say what you will about his stats and what that meant or whatever, but at this point in time, if I'm Guelph, I'm watching this game film being like, okay, if I can stop Jack Kelly and Ethan Dolby, I'm going to dare you to try to throw the ball and to try to beat us, because right now I haven't seen enough that really proves to me that you can do it just in the air. Now, stopping Western running the ball is much easier said than done, but I mean, you proved in that last game that you played against them. Yes, we've talked about this before and your frustration around you didn't score as many points, but you put up a bunch of yardage and whatever else. I mean, at the end of the day, Guelph put up 567 total yards against a Western defense, and they moved the ball, and they didn't really have an answer for Marshall McRae when he was in that quarterback running the ball. So there's a lot of things that I can feel optimistic about when it comes to this Guelph offense against a Western defense, but this Guelph defense has got to stop the run if they want any hope of winning this game.
And it's a much healthier Guelph defense than it was at this period of time, and it was a Guelph defense that, as I think we at least came to our own conclusion about, was still very much trying to cope with a lot of the losses just from graduating players, specifically in the run support aspect of their game. And of course, no bigger than losing Anthony Mortuzzo. And then of course, those bodies on the front line of the D line, as we've seen, not just with having Demetrius Masuka and add into the mix at that sort of Sam position, replacing Mortuzzo, but then starting to see Keys Wilson really come alive and starting to see obviously the continued growth of what Andre Thompson. And it was obviously a fun moment for us seeing them send him out as a captain against Western as a bit of a middle finger to them. I think, as you kind of point out, of like, we got your guy, the one who wanted to come to Western, the hometown kid and everything like that. So on the one hand, I do think this Guelph defense has really grown. Now, there's the part of me that on the one hand is trying to think about what we saw last week, both with how effective York was throwing the ball on them, defensive on Guelph's defense, and at the other hand, seeing how almost easily, it seemed like Laurier was shutting down this Western offense, doing exactly what you were just sort of speculating Guelph needs to do to slow Western down, which is focus it on the run, make them pass first, and just rely on what's been the unreliable arm of Evans so far this year. And of course, we can look at a game like this and say, well, that's a pretty good game for him. And this is coming off that game against Queens the week earlier. So in terms of that growth, I do think Guelph's in a better position from that regard. But one of the things I think came to light for us was, as you mentioned, that Marshall McRae factor was huge. I don't think Western obviously was expecting to see as much of him as they did in that game, in part because of the Tristan Aboud factor. How does that like factor in your estimation of like it's not just that Western game, but this is coming off a game for Guelph back in week 1 where they were a bit they were less effective than we'd even seen them the year prior and using some of those packages with McRae. I don't have his stats in front of me. On the whole, the year certainly reflects, I think, what we expected from him and his abilities in the ground. Probably not as many touchdowns because last year he got, I think it was about 9 or something like that on those short yardage looks, so on and so forth. But a game early in the season where they ended up having to go to him that much more. And Western, I just think clearly wasn't ready for it. At this point in the season, with how much he's been doing this year, and especially with Malloy missing and with that receiving core still being a little less than stellar, one would think that Guelph might have to figure out what that next sort of, I hate to call it trick, but I've kind of called it a bit of trickery so far on the season with their offense. Like, what is that next move for them? Because it feels like they're very much, we talk about forcing Western have to pass. Guelph, by virtue of these injuries, they're kind of in the same boat as we looked at last week. The offense was almost completely produced from Aboud and McRae, either throwing it and rushing it.
Yeah, I think you have to start looking at getting McRae just more involved in this game. Obviously, we saw him just purely be a quarterback against Western, and Western obviously very much struggled to stop him in that regard. On the year, Marshall McRae, 381 yards of rushing and 10 touchdowns. Now, a lot of that is he goes in there like a Jerome Rancourt, went near the goal line. He's a goal line quarterback, and they're getting in there. But still, 381 yards and with a long of 52 in there. I think that he showcases a lot of capabilities, and he's just dangerous anytime he's got the ball in his hands. I wouldn't be surprised to see him in the game a little bit more often than you've normally seen him in other games, just purely for that reason. From everything that I've been told, Willem Arsenault should be back healthy, ready to go for this one. So having Aboud's what should be his top receiver going up against Western is going to help. Those receivers have got to play well, and against a Western defensive secondary that I think did partially get exposed last game. Now, exposed is a tough way to look at it, especially when you're looking at the quality and the caliber of some of the receivers of that Laurier receiving core. There's not many people that could possibly do that to a Western squad, but still, there's some cracks in the armor, like we've said previously here. And if Guelph can take advantage of that, I think they're in a good spot. And I think the best way for them to take advantage is to get Aboud and McRae involved as best as they can.
Now, to talk a little bit about sort of, we alluded this on the week 9 review pod, but and this isn't, well, this is certainly part me as the Guelph Griffin alumni in the room, but not entirely, of looking at the sort of mental psyche locker room piece of it all. Because we talked to a lot of the Mustangs after the game, and a lot of it was, as you would kind of expect after that kind of beatdown, you can't really beat yourself up about it. Certainly not in the moment, because it's like, dang, we got our butts whooped. All right, let's bounce back, let's recover. There is part of me, though, as we talked about, that for a team that never is in that situation, much like we talk about, as you were alluding to some of those Greg Marshall quotes over the years, that they aren't really built to play from behind. By a similar token, this is why in years past, like sometimes you almost say that earlier season loss sometimes is better because you're able to learn from it and you're able to deal with that adversity a little bit better and how you're able to bounce back from it. not just Western taking that beating from Laurier, but with it happening right on the doorstep of the playoffs. We know a lot of these guys. I'm not here to question their mental toughness or their mental fortitude. A lot of times, though, these things are not necessarily on the surface level of how we deal with the adversity of life and of football. Sometimes it's bubbling underneath. What do you make of that part of it? Is it just, again, we know a lot of these guys, they're tough as nails. They played in high leverage games. For some of these guys, they've, been in 3-4 Yates Cups. They can deal with this. They can deal with this adversity. Do you put any stock, even if only a little bit, into the idea that, especially with that game happening right at the end of the season, especially with the 2 years of precedent building of saying that that matchup between these two teams not only determined who hosted the Yates Cup, but who hoisted the Yates Cup? How much stock, roughly, you don't have to say a number per se, but do you put in that maybe having some effect, or do you lean more so towards, like, I guess if it's nothing is in the middle and then one way is leaning slightly towards it having an effect and the other is it not? Like, where do you lean on that aspect of this game?
So it's interesting to look at because obviously, like you mentioned, this was for the first round bye. It's for the home series in the playoffs, even into the Yates Cup and everything else. But I think the funny part, I think the benefit that Western has in this is the fact that despite the fact that most times they're going 8-0 in the regular season, certainly as of late, I've spoken to a good friend of mine who was a part of those Western Mustangs back when you and I were playing, and his last year was that 2013 Western squad that went 8-0, won the Yates Cup and everything, went out and eventually lost to Calgary in the semis. But I was talking to him about, the expectations and playing at Western and everything, and he goes, "Oh yeah, Coach Marshall and the rest of that coaching staff would yell and scream at us as if we were 1-7 and we were 8-0 at the time." And I don't mean to say that to be like, oh, well, like the Western coaches, what they're doing. I mean to say that in that the Western experience and the Western expectation is always sky high, no matter what it is. So these are guys who are used to playing against a team that they're blowing out and still being nitpicked and saying, what's your punch look like? Or what's your step look like? Or how did you catch that ball? Make sure it's a form tackle. I don't think that this is going to be a thing where Western comes out of this shell shock saying, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea." And I think they're ready to bounce back from this. If there's one thing that the kind of vibe that I got from the players after we were speaking to them after that game was, okay, I'm ready for this game to be over. Let's watch the film, let's get it corrected, and then let's just move on to next week. Immediately afterwards, all of those Western guys are just talking about Guelph. Okay, we got Guelph. We got Guelph. We're playing against Guelph. So I don't really put any stock into the idea of that they're going to be affected by the big loss or anything. I think this is still Western. I think they're still going to come out of this and really get things going. The one area that I could maybe put a caveat in is in the quarterback space with Evan and with Jerome Rancourt. And regardless, previously we've talked about Evan and the lackluster performance that he's had, and we were pointed out, hey, it's the receivers actually that were in the fault here. We weren't running the proper route, so we were doing a curl and we should have done a hook and didn't turn the right way or whatever. So it's not on him, it's some of the receivers, whatever. Regardless, the passing attack for Western really did not look good against Laurier. And while Laurier had some great defense on that, obviously those defensive backs and the linebackers are great in what they do, there was a lot of throws that you and I were looking at where they were just off. Like he had overthrown receivers, or they didn't seem to be connecting. They didn't seem on the same page. At times, he's throwing it, trying to get it to his guy, Seth Robertson, who was obviously the clear number one receiver, at least in Evan's mind, going into this Western matchup. But he's double or triple covered. He's not the throw that you should be making, and yet the ball is still going there. So I am very curious to see what happens there. Evan, we know, is the consummate competitor. He's always going to be on his P's and Q's. He's always going to be focusing on how he can get better and better. But this was by far, like we talked about, his worst game that he's had at Western. that has to mean something. And I'm really interested to see how he specifically bounces back from this.
So then let's flip the script because with Guelph, they don't necessarily have a loss on the year that's as devastating as this. I mean, for me personally, the Mac game's arguably as devastating as losing by a 50 burger, but there's a different mental aspect that we could sort of, speculate on where there's been this sort of it's like the team's been kind of little buzzed all year, like they're just not as sharp as you would expect from, the depth of talent at coaches on the field, and also the fact that a lot of this core was in a very intense and close playoff game against these Mustangs a year ago. So let's flip the script then. If we're playing armchair psychologist here, the aspect of a Guelph team that's just been kind of not even cruising in neutral. It's like the engine keeps stalling out at times, and then they take it into the shop, and it's like, no, everything looks good in here. I don't like ever. All the parts are there. It's like, great. You put it back on the road. It keeps stalling out. You bring it back. So let's flip the script. Not necessarily a team that's had a devastating loss in the same nature of what Western dealt with. I mean, again, as we talked before we started recording, in our thinking about this game, it's hard to ignore the aspect of Western going to York and beating the brakes off them, and then Guelph just nearly fending them off at home. But despite that, you and I both think that this game is much closer than what those respective outings against that common opponent might speak to. And again, that comes down to this whole thing with Guelph on the year where somehow it's like in Guelph, some kind of optical illusion. You can't trust what your eyes are seeing somehow. So from the armchair psychologist standpoint, to evaluate sort of where they're at, they've obviously had, they pick up the win. They had that really strong outing offensively against Carleton a couple weeks ago. But it's this sort of on and off thing. What do you make of sort of where they're at in terms of coming into the playoffs?
It's a tough question to answer because exactly like you mentioned, this is a Guelph squad that should be a lot better than what their record shows. But then I look at each game and it's not like, oh, they got screwed out of a call or it was a close game or whatever. Like they lost the games that they lost. I mean, anybody who was listening to our podcast before the season knows we're picking this squad to like be fighting for a Yates Cup, potentially making it to a Vanier. Like this was a team that we recognize had a lot of talent. And I think that if that talent is on display and it's on display properly, and those guys are operating at a high level, that this is going to be a great game. And I think it really will be a back and forth. But this also very easily could be Western finding their rhythm and blowing out Guelph. So to me, with what I've seen so far, I think that you'll see the better part of what a Guelph Griffin team has looked like so far. If you're looking at it from like middle of the pack, being in that neutral setting, like you said, being completely stalled out and not doing anything, or running and humming along like everything is going fine and that engine's roaring, I think they're going to be somewhere in the 75% range towards that. I think you're going to see some good stuff, especially from this offense. I think that Aboud is slowly going to get better and better. As far as I know, there is no Ethan Pyle again in this game. He's going to be out once again. So having Riley Brackenbury in there, but I know Coach McDonald is going to do everything he can to make sure that Max von Muhldorfer is not just teeing off against Riley Brackenbury. But I think that this offensive line still matches up relatively well against this D line for Western. I think that they'll give Aboud or McRae time to be in the pocket and throw or take off and run with it. If those receivers can step up and come out with a few big plays, I'm confident that this team can hang in with the Mustangs at bare minimum.
Yeah, the Ethan Pyle piece, you add that into the fact of no Donovan Malloy and no Caleb Sargent. And that's a really tough situation to be able to be in. Tom, I don't know if there's any more angles that you have to pick on it. Honestly, that aspect of the Pyle injury is, I mean, devastating a number of reasons. If for no more the fact that the more weeks he misses, obviously the bigger the injury was to begin with, and this is a young man who has a football career beyond U Sports to think about, and I hope that whatever has been ailing him is one that he can bounce back from, so he can pursue this as a professional. With that said, I told you I'm taking my Guelph Griffins on the road. I'm sticking with that dang pick. If for any other reason for Dakota Vine and him doing this run that, he has to do against York for the York loss that he took to Guelph, that, I don't know if we'll do a double or nothing. I'm not going to make him run a marathon if the Griffins win, but maybe I'll run alongside him if his ponies take out my Griffs. I do think that, I mean, it's just from that game against Laurier, and maybe it's like they're the best team in the country. So it's like maybe we somehow are just underrating Laurier through all this, but it kind of feels like the inverse of what we started to see teams do to U of T. And I feel almost like ridiculous that I'm comparing U of T and Western offensively, but teams where you are very much, your bread is buttered very much. I was going to say one trick pony, and though the metaphor somewhat works with the Mustangs, it's certainly offensive to Western to call them such. But where, your bread is certainly buttered in doing one thing and doing it really, really well. And a Guelph team that has a really strong linebacking core and has a really strong defensive secondary that with how Evan's been playing of late, you feel like you can trust him against those guys. And as we know too, Western gets the passing game off, playing the play action. So if the run game's not there, don't even bite on it. Like just, if you're in that secondary, if you're in that man, just dare them to throw it on you. I do think they'll be able to move it offensively. The question is whether they can score. And at this point, if you're within the 40-yard line, everything's third down territory. Because as we always talk about it, you can't settle for threes. You have to get sixes and not threes when you're playing the Western Mustangs. And I don't even trust Guelph to get threes. So honestly, just Dan Campbell the heck out of it. Go for gold on all these. And, I'll ride the momentum of them having the win and Western perhaps being in a position they're not terribly comfortable in.
I respect the hell out of that, and I think that Guelph is certainly in a spot to make a big push, but I'm going with the ponies in this one. I'm taking Western. I think that they find their groove again, and I think this is more so how impressive that what we're going to look back at on that Laurier win is more so how impressive Laurier is rather than, Western fell off or Western's cooked or whatever else. But I am taking the ponies to pick up the dub.
Well, let's now take our talents, Tom, to the end of the 401. A little town called Little Rock, Arkansas. Win City under the shadow of the Golden Arches. The tutelage, the mentorship, the coaching of one JP the Don Suricelli. The Windsor Lancers are hosting the Ottawa Gee-Gees in a Thanksgiving rematch, the Thanksgiving thriller from the nation's capital that saw the Windsor Lancers roll into Ottawa, continue the hot streak that they were on, that they continued the following week, last week in Kingston, this immense second half roll that they've been on, and host a team that, there's rarely a better matchup we get in the OUA than when these clubs face off. Tom, we've had this conversation, and you were mentioning this and talking about Windsor being ranked behind Queens currently in the top 10 of like, you not only beat them, you went to their house and you beat them. You and I obviously played at fairly centrally located schools within the province. Yeah, Windsor and Ottawa, respectively, were long trips, but nothing that compares to when these teams go face one another. So this is purely conjecture. I'm asking you to use your imagination, if you will, but no doubt you've had forms of this. For a team in Ottawa, knowing that these guys went 8.5 hours to our house and, a 30-24 final that, nice run at the end by Ottawa to bring it close. I'd say at least 2 to 3/4 of that, all Windsor. To now say we have to go on the road to now play this team as well. Oh, and also, we nearly faltered in our last game of the season against a U of T team that had been knocked out of the playoffs 2 weeks prior. And this is a Windsor team that knocked off one of the top ranked teams in the nation in their own house. There's a clear difference in where these two teams have been going at the end of the season, and an Ottawa team that has to deal with this Windsor team in Win City. I'd have to imagine whether, again, it's these things that sit below the surface. I'm sure for Ottawa, they're saying all the right things. Hey, we know that we play them tough, whether it's here, whether it's there. If we clean up some stuff on offense, if we can limit that running game, so on and so forth. Underneath the surface, there has to be part of them, or some of those side conversations that go on maybe of, gosh, if we had to play this team again, we have to go to them, really? That's a tough beat, and that feels as if that would be a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, regardless, no matter what, that's going to be a very tough pill to swallow. But especially when you think about the how their season ended, and not just from a game standpoint, but in terms of a travel standpoint or lack thereof for these GGs. On September 20th, they played against Laurier at their house. Then they had a bye. Then they played against Carleton and the Panda. Then they played against Windsor at home, and then they played against Toronto at home. So this is a squad that's sat nice and comfy in Ottawa for the past number of weeks. And now not only are you telling them they got to travel, but they got to travel all the way down to the end of the 401 to play against a Windsor squad that always plays very well at home. And while, yes, I've never done the drive from Windsor to Ottawa, I have done the drive from Hamilton to Quebec City, and that's 8.5 hours. And it's a slog. It really is, especially, hopefully, when both these teams are going to have two buses. Because if you're trying to jam everybody on one bus, that's a tight squeeze. But going into this, I think the mentality around what it means to travel and the mentality with how these coaches are handling themselves really goes a long way to go into the actual travel itself. I would have to imagine that when this travel happens, likely on the Friday, I don't think anybody's going to wake up at like midnight to do the drive, but you're going to have some time there, and especially if there's an offensive and a defensive bus, there's going to be film that's there. You're going to have guys who are walking through film and whatever, whether that's coach run or player run or whatever. You're not going to watch film for 7.5 hours. So there's going to be some downtime. How do you do that? Like, what's your coaching philosophy? Hey, no screwing around in there. You got to stay focused. You know, the old high school, eyes front, shut up, no talking, all of that stuff. I don't think that really flies in this kind of scenario here. You have to allow your guys to have a little bit of looseness, in my opinion, before the game. So I think the mentality of how you travel is very imperative and is going to mean a lot going into this. I think Windsor is a team that just expects to travel, and especially with that moniker, the blue collar gold swagger, that team embodies that. And I don't think they had any trouble swallowing the pill of having to travel. Obviously, they came away from that massive travel 2-0, so they feel pretty good about it. There's an Ottawa squad that, while they are in Ottawa, they have Carleton that's there. And even if they do have to travel to Queens, Queens is only a couple hours away. Now, obviously, they didn't play against Queens, but like I just mentioned, their back end of their season was very favorable to them staying at home. So this is going to be a real big test even before they step one foot on a football field, just from that standpoint.
So let's start to break down the X's and O's, the Jimmies and Joes. When we went into this matchup 2 weeks ago or so, or coming out of that matchup 2 weeks ago, I should say, one of the major stories was the interceptions that Windsor was forcing out of Josh Jansen and this continued failure in the rushing attack for the GGs. Charles Asselin, again, in large part, on the whole, at the end of the year, you know, it might be a very serviceable year we have in total, and you play it in with the totality of the various other pieces that they have. And we always talk about this receiving core they have with Noah Avery and Robin Couillot, And we saw last week the return of Romeo Lucier, and I don't want to undersell that. Guibert Thibault, Gerard Boucard, who had a really good game against Windsor. But on the one hand, a team that's struggling to be able to get that rushing attack going. And on the other hand, it's, consecutive weeks now where this is sort of where I guess the term easier said than done really comes into effect, where, we've already talked about the game before this, Western and Guelph being one of just being like, well, just slow down the run, just make them pass, right? Just overcommit to it. That's all you got to do. For Windsor, again, not to throw any shade or sling any mud at Domofsky, but clearly you'd rather the ball and the game be in his hands than in Wavy Mambo, than in Liam Talbot, than in Andrew Delaney. Andrew Delaney also didn't play in this game against Ottawa either. So on the one hand, for me, an Ottawa team that really needs to both find their run game, on the other hand, do something. And again, we love Riley Hildebrand. We love Daniel Briere, Jackson Brashear, Louis Prince, all these guys they have on that front seven. To be able to say, if this Windsor team is going to beat us and they're going to put up points, it's got to be Domofsky. Like, that has to be the philosophy going into this. And if you can, the more balls you're forcing him to throw up, the more opportunities you're given for, your Patrick Cumberbatch, your Denny Ferdinand, your Nicolas Dion, Jackson Brashear. But again, easier said than done. Ottawa needs to find their run game. They need to find a way to slow down this run attack for Windsor.
Yeah. For the folks who either just started listening to us this year or have forgotten, Charles Aslan, what he meant to this Ottawa GG's team just last year and what he was doing, his numbers last year, he finishes the regular season with 809 rushing yards and 8 touchdowns on 138 attempts. Pretty solid. This year so far, on 101 attempts, 440 yards rushing to only 2 touchdowns. Also in the previous year, no fumbles at all. This year, 1 fumble, 1 lost. So obviously a drastic drop-off in terms of production from this GG squad in the run game, exactly like you mentioned, from last year to this year. Now, Josh Jansen has been playing well and things, sure, but I don't think it's well enough to warrant not having a run game or not focusing on said run game. Now they're getting Suleiman Kamara in there as well, and he's been doing some stuff, but even in this game, Josh Jansen, 36 for 50, 383 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Like, throwing the ball 50 times, that seems excessive to me. And a Charles Aslan, who, yes, finishes the day with 37 rushes on 12 attempts, I haven't seen the same level of creativity to get him the ball that we saw in previous years. Like, I don't remember seeing him like catching a swing pass, for example, or leading out into the flats, or even being like a slot receiver type, having a 2-back system where Kamara's more so that standard running back type, and then you leak out Aslan into the flats or into, especially if you're doing like a trips situation where you've got 3 receivers into the boundary and then you're pulling out a will linebacker that's typically not your best pass cover guy. You want a one-on-one on a pass situation with a will linebacker and Aslan? I'm taking Aslan all day. But we just don't seem to see him really getting involved into the offense here, which is a shame because obviously he showed he's got a ton of capabilities. Now, obviously in that Ottawa receiving core, yeah, they've got some studs. Tristan Gilbert-Thibault, Robin Couliot, Noah Avery, really, really a great player. And any one of those guys can go off. But I think being more dynamic on offense is going to help you here, especially against a Windsor front that if you just say, yeah, if Ottawa comes back into this game going, yeah, we're going to throw the ball 50 times, Liam Hoskins and Ahmad Taylor are licking their chops because that means they can just pin their ears back and come after Jansen and try to add to that unbelievable sack total that you pointed out to me last week or last pod. So we have to see this Ottawa GG's offense get a little bit more variety for sure.
Yeah, you think Braxton Johnson doesn't want to see them throw 60 times?
Yeah.
And it's that same thing that we were talking about of when you have guys like we talk about that overcommitting to one aspect, and you can trust these guys in the back end, Robert Springer, Istvan Asibo-Dotsi, Ethan John, sort of as this trifecta they have back there, the up and coming ascension of one Marco Piccioni. Man, oh man, you can be just focusing on just bringing that pressure and slowing down any semblance of a run game. Now, of course, we did see that passing attack pick up for Ottawa. It was only a matter of time. When you throw it as many instances as they did, the numbers were going to bear out. And, you read out the numbers. Still, it's about 70% completion percentage. Not terrible, but again, those 3 interceptions and when you get the ball into some of these guys' hands, whether it's Asibo Dotsi or whether it's Robert Springer, it's not just the turnover you have to be worried about. It's the possible points going back the other way around. Let's flip the script, though. I mean, we've seen a year of years from Wavy Mambo, and it's an interesting comparison to think about the year he's having with the year Ethan Dolby's having. I say because of the aspect of, when we have discussed the record-breaking year Dolby's had, and this is just our own thought. We've talked to other folks and folks around Western who've said similar things of like, well, in the past, there's such a depth of running back for the Mustangs that it's hard for one individual to get those same kind of numbers. Similar with Windsor, in this sort of recent iteration of this team, that three-headed monster, Joey Zorn, Christopher John, Wavy Mambo, the youngest of the bunch, adding in Liam Talbot into that as well. It was, like we always said, they had maybe the best running game, even though none of their running backs were going to end up at the end of the year as OUA All-Stars. He's clearly shown that as the sole back, and it's a big O-line, it's a good O-line. I don't think it's a great O-line, and that's not a shot at them per se, but that's also in recognition of, like, Windsor has had like great O-lines. Like, we know what the bar is of great O-lines that Windsor's had, and that's been the standard for great O-lines in the OUA. So it's just saying that, look, it's a good O-line. They're huge. It's not the same as when they had George Una and all those cats on this line as well. Mm-hmm. So there's something to be said of just really to add into what Mambo's been able to do as the sole guy when the running attack and the O-line has been just by virtue of who's in there a little bit weaker. And I'm curious to see now with just this aspect of how Ottawa's been a bit vulnerable in that aspect, teams being able to run the ball a little bit at times, is how much do they maybe now need to overcommit on that before, or how much can they overcommit on that before we can start to see Domofsky really start to make some plays? Because let's not forget that game that we always harken back to 2 years ago, the near or the hold that, if only just for driving Murray Drinkwater water crazy, I'll still say it was a bit questionable. Was a Nick Domofsky led team. Like, this is a guy that's played in these high leverage games in there. So I guess how much do you think this Ottawa team can really commit to Wavy Mambo? Because you threw the question to me, and I think we went through the exercise. He's a top 5 running back in USports right now. And like like when you pair it up with that defense, that is a recipe for a damn good football team. And this is a damn good football team.
Yeah. I mean, Wavy Mambo is playing some really great football as of late. He's been a solid running back, but almost the same thing that we were talking about with a Western style that you pointed out. Now that he's the primary back, you really start to see the greatness that he has, the vision, the patience that he has, waiting for blocks to properly set up before taking off and hitting the gaps and going from there. Like, I think that this is a great opportunity for Wavy to continue on and saying, I am a hell of a running back. I know at the 55, you've been talking a lot about your guy, Joey Zorn. He's great, but I'm pretty damn good as well. And he's been showing that all year. I think the world of this young man, and I think that he's going to do some great things. Even in the last game, 9 attempts, 142 yards and a touchdown. Like, that's some really impressive stuff from this young man. And I have to imagine that they're going to continue to do the same. When it comes to Domofsky and this passing attack, certainly has left something to be desired here. In that last game against Ottawa, 11 for 16, 149 yards, no touchdown, and one interception. That's very much been a typical kind of day for Domofsky in the air. Not a ton of touchdowns and some interceptions here. At times, obviously not nearly where you want them to be, but uh, sorry, I had it up. Domofsky's stats on the year: 64% completions rating. He's averaging around 208 passing yards per game, 3 touchdowns in the air to 6 interceptions. Not a great ratio, and unfortunate because we saw flashes of what we thought Domofsky was going to be. Even last year, I know we've mentioned this a number of times, but that game against Guelph, when he came in there after being off of injury, he showed off, and you and I are looking at each other like, oh man, like this, he looks really good. And then obviously goes down again with another injury and has to go out in that one. We haven't seen that level of greatness from Domofsky as of yet. He hasn't had one big game that you can point to and saying, oh yeah, like that's what he can be. So certainly seeing some struggles from that regard. And even if you come out against Ottawa and you were able to get the win primarily running the ball, you are not going to be able to win a Yates Cup without passing the ball. So that passing attack has got to get there. And it's not like he doesn't have great receivers to throw to. Tyree Quason, Colby Ginn, Kareem Cotton, like these guys are really top quality. We just need to see more production from Domofsky in total, especially if they want to get to where they want to go.
To get to where they want to go, absolutely. But on this day, to quote the great Canadian philosopher Carly Rae Jepsen, hey, I just met you. And this is crazy, but here's my number. So call me Waby. It's Waby Mambo rushing the dang ball for them. It's that defense shutting down this reeling Josh Jansen-led offense for the Ottawa GGs. And to me, Windsor's picking up this game. And I think it'll be close just by virtue of playoffs and by virtue of this being a professional Ottawa GGs team, even though some of those mistakes we've seen of late kind of speak against that a little bit. But as far as what we've been seeing of late, that same exercise we went through of comparing Guelph and Western, of sort of where we think they're at, not just in the game, but all these other considerations, add on the travel, add on the fact that it's a team that came to your house and beat you already. It's Windsor. And again, I think it'll, if I were to pick between the two, I'd say of it being a Windsor tight win or a Windsor blowout. I'll play it conservative and say it's tight. But there's also a not too small part of me being like, Windsor might just blow the doors off them because this defense is playing at a whole other level right now. And that rushing attack is as good, darn near as good as anyone in the OUA.
Yeah. We have had a lot of stock in this Ottawa GG's team for a while now, especially after that very close game against Laurier where they very much could have won that game. Have not seen anywhere close to that same level of production from them since. They don't seem like the same team for whatever reason. And Windsor is on a heater right now. I'm taking the Lancers at home to continue that streak.
Well, let's finish up our OUA quarterfinal preview by taking a trip down to Kingston, where the Queen's Golden Gales play host to your McMaster Marauders. Queens coming off that tough loss, nail biter at home against those Windsor Lancers that we were just talking about. And Mac narrowly coming off a win narrowly against the Carleton Ravens in a bit of a shootout, an outcome that we haven't seen often from Mac this year. Frankly, I don't remember the last true shootout that we've seen Mac really get themselves in. It was really nice to see. Of course, Lucas Barisi was at the helm, at the reins. Luke Dahlman's been out. Maybe you have an injury update on him. I certainly haven't heard anything myself. We've have it on pretty good authority that 44 Justin Pace will be back for these Golden Gales. That's a huge pickup for them. And this is a matchup from that same week 2 that we talked about in just breaking down Western versus Guelph, where we saw Queens roll into Hamilton and beat them 38-4, a game where we really were still at that stage of not seeing, it's a great Queens defense, but I think it was also fair to say Mac really wasn't doing all that much offensively, even take into consideration the juggernautness of this Queens defense. Tom, in comparison with that other week 2 matchup that we looked at, to me, this one feels like the most, yeah, you kind of need to throw that first game out a little bit. I'm certainly giving the edge to Queens, especially being at home and just for so many factors. You're given the tick in the box in a number of categories, or you're slanting, you're sliding the it over to the Queens side of things. But this is certainly a matchup that if folks are just going to look at that week 2 battle between these teams, you're vastly going to overlook the growth that Mac's been on. And I think you're going to vastly underlook or overlook, I guess, again, the tumult that Queens has been dealing with towards the end of the season, pretty much since that Waterloo game in many ways.
Yeah, very much so. I think that this is a Queens team that, while has obviously won games and has looked solid while doing it, I don't know, has not seemed as dominant as I had expect them to really be here. And exactly like you mentioned, I mean, they play against York, and 57-5 is as dominant as you could really be, especially at home and what they were doing. But against your Griffins, we were in the house for that, obviously, for homecoming for you, honoring that 2015 Yates Cup championship team and everything. They pick up the win, but Guelph very much in that game for the majority of it. And I don't think we spoke to the Queens folks after the game. I certainly don't think that they would say that that was their best game that they had played. And then they go into the bye after that, and they play against Windsor, and obviously end up losing that game 31-28 in a tight one here. And I think have gone into, I don't know if getting into a rut is the right thing to say, but are certainly haven't been playing their very best football in the past couple of weeks here. Now, that's not a shot against them by any means. This is still one of the most talented teams that you have, period. Look at the coaching staff and everybody. But there is something to say about playing your best football when you're going into the playoffs. You see those teams that are riding that wave and riding that energy, and they bring a whole lot more to it. Not this, and I think that Queens is going to obviously play very well. They're at home once again, and they always play tough in that environment. But there is absolutely going to be a level of what my old offensive line coach and Jason Riley used to say of weathering the storm. This is a MAC squad that has won 4 of their last 5 regular season games, beat a very good Carleton team at home to secure their spot in the playoffs, and is riding a big wave, especially starting the year off 0-3 and now finishing at 4-4. There is a lot of confidence in that Marauder locker room, and rightfully so. And so right off the hop, I think you are going to get the Maroon punch in the mouth. And I think they are going to really come at this with a ton of confidence and a lot of gusto and everything. And if Queens can, like I said, weather the storm and come back into this, they're in a good spot. And I think they're in place to really come back and bounce back and get into that. But there is that weathering the storm. I've said that a few times now, but I think that's the best acronym that I can kind of give for that, or simile.
Metaphor.
Words.
I'm
not an English major.
No, you got it. Well, I think part of the aspect that makes this a hard one to not predict, predict's not the right word, but to sort of to just call based on what we saw earlier, is that we've kept harkening back to the youth of this McMaster team, and then you look at, even with, I don't know if you have an update about Luke Dahlman about this game that coming up of his status, but a game in which it's a serviceable 14 for 23, 109 in the air. Doesn't turn it over, but doesn't get a touchdown. So it's not a game that's going to lose you any ball games. I mean, it's certainly not going to win you many. So if it's not winning you, I guess but it's not losing you. What is it doing for you? Not all that much anyways. But we've certainly seen, and not all these guys are young guys, but that core group of Aiden Nemeth, Jackson Taylor, Everett Reed, Nathan Dankers really become a a top tier potential of a core. At times you see maybe one of those guys really go off and then the others have a few nice catches. We're still really waiting for the Jackson Taylor game. But more than any of that is that defense that we've seen really grow over the season, starting with that linebacking core and the growth on the front line, Chuck Wally and some of these other guys, the big guys in the middle. And, for what it's worth, like, a game in which they limited Kasari to 100 yards and a touchdown. Like, limit, yeah, I think that's a fair way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, were they able to just move the ball in the air and get what they needed through the passing attack? Sure. So maybe they just felt they didn't need to rush it all that much. But I think the strength of that defense, which is the front seven for Mac, did a good job. And it's a front seven that's only gotten better. It's only gotten stronger. It's only gone, like, being able to play 6 more football games for that young a core is like the amount of growth you go through on that. It's exponential to say the least. Whereas for, again, not that this Queens team hasn't been able to grow through the year, but when you have an older team, a lot of 4th and 5th years as those core players, toward the end of, whether it's your last season or one of your last seasons, that you're just not going to be able to have as much growth. It's like with anything, like, when you start going to the gym and you make these huge gains at first, then it starts to sort of peter off, start to plateau off. So for Queens, I'm certainly excited to see what game plan they come into this one with, because if they think it's going to be anything like the defense, we'll start with that. They saw, well, really all aspects of this team. They saw, I just like it's and you read it off, the fact that they went 4-1 down the stretch. Like, it is night and day what Mac's been able to do in terms of their growth and turning the season around. That looked like it looked like the year from hell for this team to start with.
Yeah, you're going to have to play your very best football here, because I think Mac's really going to bring something. I mean, here's a quick comparison. McMaster in that Queens game had 145 yards of total offense. Total. The Mac that played against Carleton had 487. That's a drastic difference in terms of the level of play. And once again, Luke Thalman not playing in that game. That was Lucas Barisi and what he was able to do. So if I'm Queens, I think you watch your former film to get a sense of what your matchups looked like and, who they had in certain spots, certainly. But I'm more so watching Carleton film or the more recent games that Mac has played over your previous film, because exactly that. This is a different team. This is a much better team. And have to assume Coach Grandy, with that phenomenal defensive mind that he has, he's going to cook up a different game plan to go into this one rather than the one that they had going up against Queens initially here. So you're going to see some different stuff. And I think he's going to have an answer to what Coach Nez loves to run in that offense, which is that power read where you're running power to the field and then you have the receivers on the backside. If that will doesn't flow with the power, then you give it. And if he does, you just rip it out to your receiver out there and it turns into a wide receiver screen with numbers. I think that he's going to have an answer for that. And I think that with still a young squad in the secondary for this defense, but now having real game experience and getting better and better as games have gone on, I think they're going to do a whole lot better in terms of guarding against that stuff. So, yeah, this is going to be a really interesting game, and a game that confirmed you and I are going to be in the house for. We are going to be in Kingston watching this game live, and I can't wait to watch it.
I mean, Richardson Stadium is one of the premier locations we have. I think we'll be on the field to be able to check this one out as well, just like we were in those van days. It's an awesome time awesome place to check out a football game. Thank you so much to the folks at Queens for hooking us up with that. And obviously when you talk about, if you're Queens, you're obviously going to watch that Carleton film. You go back to a bit of your first matchup, of course. It's obviously a night and day difference between that Carleton defense and the Queens defense, but a big piece of what Mac was able to get going that made them so successful against Carleton was that running attack of Braden Kelly. And we've seen good, rushing days by Mac where it's Micah and Braden kind of compiling for a decent outing. This was the best single rushing effort, I think, by a Mac runner in quite some time. 88 yards and 2 touchdowns. And like low key, maybe that's people think I'm taking a shot at Mac, but like obviously when they had Keegan, they weren't too bullish on running the ball all that much. I caveat that recognizing the difference of who they were playing in terms of this defense that they dealt with in Carleton and what Queens has to offer, and especially the sort of elephant in the room, if you will, is that it's a Queens defense that's now bringing back Justin Pace, as we talked about. I've thrown at you sometimes a bit unfairly this episode, these questions of where do you think these teams are at, the mentality. This is a Queens team that, and again, we've talked about this, suspension for Pace and the incident in itself. And, we hear a number of perspectives. And I think overall, aside from our shared dislike of how the OUAs handled it, I think we've tried to discuss the issue itself fairly even-handedly. And part of the story has been Queens's, almost martyring of Justin Pace's absence. So he's coming back now. We've been playing the armchair psychologist. Obviously, as a player, we know that supercharges their defense. How else do you feel that factors in given the time that he's missed, what he's had to deal with over these last couple of weeks? There's part of me that just says he's a man on a mission more so than he always is. There's part of me that wonders, that's a lot of time off. It's the classic rust versus rest conversation that comes up so often in sports. Pace back in the lineup. Obviously, it's a boon for them defensively. Is it that simple? Do you read into any other components of that with him fitting back in after being away from the game for about a month now?
I like to lean on previous experiences as often as I can to help give me the best sense of really how to talk about this. And while it's obviously not the same thing, different times, different positions completely, I played with a certain man who had to deal with a 3-game suspension and then came back and won. Kyle Quinlan, obviously a quarterback rather than a linebacker, and lots of differences for sure. But
I'll just say quickly, people were celebrating in Guelph when we heard he was going to be out, and then you freaking guys still beat us with Marshall Ferguson. Doggone it.
Yeah, Marshall, pretty good quarterback himself there.
Yeah.
But when you talk about this, and especially because that suspension with McMaster, not to hone in on this too much, but because that came from the university, he was not allowed to practice with us at all. Like, he was fully off the campus for 3 weeks. And then he came back against Toronto and threw for 600 yards. But you talk about a team that in those 3 games that he was out, like you mentioned, Guelph being one of them, we won those games. And then when he came back, the shot in the arm that it was to the entire team that ultimately helped us lead us on that Vanier run that we had in 11. Obviously, a very big comparison to kind of make here, but I think Justin Pace is that kind of quality of player on that defense, very clearly the leader of that defense and a big part of that leadership on that team. And to get him back into the fold and to fully see 44 back at that middle linebacker spot, I think is going to do a lot of really great things for this team as a whole. I think the energy is going to be very high. I think they're going to be excited to have their guy back. And, even when you're looking at that Windsor game, Wavy Mumbo had some fantastic runs, and I think no matter what he would have, but you could see a couple of times where the holes that he's running through are massive, and he's able to take advantage of that. I have to assume that if 44 is in there, they're not as big at bare minimum, if they're there at all. And so getting him back in the lineup here, getting him back in the fold, and having him play again, I think is going to do a lot of really great things for this team, and you're going to see a lot of positive and high vibes from the Queens guys to have him back.
Well, and again, clearly just how they were, celebrating him during those games. They obviously he's their guy. He's the captain on the team at his best. He's one of the best in the whole country. Undoubtedly, that's a huge component of this, as we've already detailed. Let's flip the script and just talk a little bit about Queens offensively from the standpoint of we looked at what Mac was able to do against a Carleton team as a product of, hey, you know what? They're trending positively. Like what they're seeing, like what we're seeing, even though it was Jamie and not Luke, or sorry, not Jamie Barisi, even though it was Lucas Barisi. Goodness gracious me, oh my. Overall, still positive things, that running game getting going. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They were playing the Carleton Ravens. Queens and Alex Vreeken coming off of his worst outing against the Windsor Lancers. Less than 50% completion percentage, a touchdown, an interception, really nothing all that promising, but asterisk, asterisk, asterisk against one of the best defenses in the Windsor Lancers that they're dealing with. You mentioned, though, of course, that Guelph game for the Queens folks undoubtedly left a little bit wanting. Only 2 touchdowns to 1 interception. The passing percentage is good. Guelph did a pretty good job of trying to kind of blanket things on him. Good, not great outing for him. And on that piece of it, it's been a fairly strong year for Alex. But how much do you read into that game against Windsor? Do you just say, look, a team with a rock star defense came in here. They pulled off the upset at home on our homecoming, shake it off, get back to work? Or did that highlight some of the things that I'm not, I feel like I've unfairly maybe said that you've been critical of Alex, where I think if I can sort of play back what I believe is your take, which is just that we know at his best how good he can be. So when we don't see that, it's just the standard that we hold great quarterbacks to. How much of that Windsor loss is sort of something indicative of what those criticisms of him not being able to consistently be that great quarterback is, and how much of it is just, look, Windsor's done that to pretty much everyone all season long. Just shake it off.
Yeah, I think, to be honest with you, I'm going with Windsor's defense being that good. Let's not forget, Alex Vreeken gets sacked 4 times in this game, and he's running for his life a whole lot even without getting sacked. So he's constantly being flushed out of the pocket because that Windsor passing or rush is just so incredible. And I think that's a huge reason why he has the incompletions that he has and why he forces that interception, because of that rush. So I think that being said, still throwing for 201 yards and a touchdown still showcases that he's able to make some things work even despite the pressure that's coming at him. But he is going to need that offensive line to play their best game, because while obviously I'm taking that Windsor pass rush more than the Marauders as a whole, what Christian Chuck-Wally has been doing at that defensive end spot, he's becoming a problem. And I'll make the call out now, and I'll do it again when we're focusing on just Mac. I'm saying that Christian Chuck-Wally will win the JP Metris during his time at McMaster.
I thought you were calling out for this year. I was getting that.
No, he's pretty good. He's not that good, not yet. But he will definitely win the JP Metris during his time at McMaster. The speed that he's showed, the ability to get after the quarterback in his first year coming straight out of high school has been really impressive, and I think he's going to get better and better. And I think that if you talk to Nicholas Henning or you talk to Jazz Kyra, they would not say that they had their best game against Windsor, and they're certainly going to want to try to get back into the form and the quality that we know of them as offensive linemen and offensive tackles in particular. But I think Christian Chuck-Wally is going to have some success, and he's going to flush Vreeken at least a few times here. So Alex is going to have to confidently be able to throw on the run and to escape pressure. And obviously he has that ability. I mean, he had that 7-yard scamper for a touchdown in that game as well. But I think the performance that we saw against Windsor, I would attribute that more to the Windsor defense rather than Alex Vreeken not having a good game.
Well, in that matchup specifically of Henning versus Chuck-Wally is so awesome from the standpoint of, I believe Henning, I believe, was a converted basketball player into football, and Chuck Wally, not a converted player, but someone who played some tight end receiver as well as playing defensive line at the high school level. So just the athleticism of these guys on the line, it's such a testament of modern line play in general, of like, just no longer you're just, well, I mean, Windsor kind of throws out a bit of an old school looking O line there, but just these darn athletes that are just so mobile and so strong at the same time. So let's then talk about the matchup then of that interior O line, though admittedly we don't often talk about them by name because they don't have the same gravitas as those tackles do. But just specifically, talking about Alex maybe having to get flushed out a little bit. That's one thing for if he's able to get out, but if he's stepping up and it's old big 94 and Greg Palmer waiting to wrap him up in his bare paws, that's a bit of an interesting dilemma for them. Obviously, we saw Braxton Johnson do his thing against this O-line, and Braxton's looked like, perhaps one of the better interior guys that we have in the league. Maybe he's got a second team OUA All-Star bid in the cards for him. What do you make of that matchup? I mean, obviously, when we think of Jared Kasari being able to get downhill, that's going to be part of that aspect as well. How well he can run it effectively and how well these guys can get vertical displacement on someone like Palmer. But specifically in terms of that pass rush and having possibly Vrika needing to step up into that pocket, Big 94 is going to be there waiting them on a few of those. And I have never experienced it, nor do I ever want to, but I can't imagine it's all that good a feeling getting taken down by Greg Palmer.
No, I don't imagine that it's a very comfortable feeling for anybody. But as you mentioned, we haven't really talked about that interior offensive line for Queens. And we're two former offensive linemen. If we don't do it, nobody will. So from left to right, the guys who have been starting for this Queens squad: Jazz Kara at left tackle, at guard Alex Hurst, number 78 Alex Hurst, at center number 67 Riley Sherman, at right guard number 63 Daniel Sudak, and at right tackle number 71 Nicholas Henning. This is a great Queens offensive line, as they damn near always have. It seems to be built into the DNA of Queens football. But as you mentioned, we talked about how much better that defensive secondary has been playing for McMaster. We talked about Christian Chuck Wally, but the rest of this D-line is playing some really good football. What Greg Palmer at that one tech spot and Dominic Limani at that three tech have been doing has really been fantastic. And I think that they're going to have another really great game in this one. One of the strengths that Jared Kasari has is the ability to see the gap and hit the gap almost at full speed after like 3 steps. If you can get penetration consistently against him and have to slow him up, even if you don't necessarily make the tackle, if he's got to dodge you before able to really get things going and you leave time for Aaron Lavers, Tony Sestanovic, and Isaiah Shields to come downhill and make some tackles, I feel pretty good about that particular game plan, especially with how well the three of them have been playing. Isaiah, not just with his ability to come up against the run, but his ability in the pass as well, in that dropping him into that deep third as one of the other safety looks and then coming downhill and making some grabs. That's how he's gotten a couple of the interceptions as of late here. So I anticipate a lot of really great things from that standpoint. And I think that this McMaster front seven should have a really good game. And I don't think that I certainly don't think that Jared Kasari is going to rush for 200 yards. I think keeping him under 100 is really tough, and I don't think that's going to happen either. So it's going to be somewhere in the middle there.
Now for the Queens folks, we haven't really talked about the upside of this team, and in large part, that's because at the end of the day, as much of that growth that Mac's shown with pace back in the middle, with what Oliver Jackson, what Stephen Capet, what that secondary that is just loaded with stars across the board has, that is just as one-sided a matchup as we probably have this weekend is Mac's offense. Yes, they've grown, but as we already detailed, though Lucas Parisi's shown good stuff, he is still your backup quarterback. And I don't know if we have an update on the status, but even with Thalman in there, yes, I expect a different matchup. And I could see this being a game that early on, maybe coming out of the first quarter, it's a low scoring affair. Maybe these teams have struggled to get their offense going, Queens perhaps as well. But I think that Queens will be able to figure out the offensive side of things a lot easier than Mac will eventually. And though we've seen Everett Reed come on strong of late, we've seen good things from Nathan Dankers, and we just know that Jackson Taylor at any point can go off. That matchup with these defensive backs, Miller Melanson with Ian St. Arnaud, Jared Seaway with Keegan Vanek, and then all those dudes patrolling the middle, starting with pace, is just such a tough beat for them, especially as we know we know that Coach P, I know he's not the offensive coordinator, but as you always talk about, those crossing routes, you're sending them right into the heart of that defense. At the end of the day, I think that's way too big a hill for them to climb. I can see it being tight early, bit of a defensive rock fight. Queens will get it going on offense. I think they're going to lean on them, pound the rock. Yeah, that battle in the trenches with Palmer, with Bolt, with Chuck Wally, with Lavers, and that linebacking core is going to there may be an explosion. One of these players may spontaneously combust from all the energy of just these bodies colliding. But at the end of the day, I think it'll be Queens coming out on the positive side of that. And I don't see the recipe for Mac moving the ball effectively, or I should say consistently, against Queens. So for me, that's my take on these Golden Gales in this game and why they're going to be moving on to the OUA semifinals.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty terrible matchup for McMaster offensively here. When you look at the seniority of this Queens defense and the capabilities that they have, this is going into the heart or the teeth of the lion, as they say. I think that this is going to provide a really big challenge, and I think that you're going to see a different result in terms of the offense. I think they are going to do much better than what they did in that week 2 loss than what they had, and I think the receivers have been playing well, and Everett Reed has been coming up and all of that. Which is why I'm taking McMaster to win this game. I'm picking the boys. I'm going with the Maroon. They're coming away with this one. They are going to shock the world. I really think that the offense is going to do enough that they are going to be able to get into a spot. They're going to force Queens' offense to be in a bad spot and pin their ears back and keep coming. So I'm picking the Marauders to win in this one.
Tom, give me a quick caca.
I can't do that high-pitched squeal that you hear after every first down, but I'm taking the boys.
Well, goodness gracious, thankfully this game's in Kingston, so we won't have to hear that godforsaken noise. I love the pick. The defense doing enough to give the offense a shot to keep them in that. I absolutely love it, and the thought of us being in the house for such an occurrence to happen would be amazing. Tom, I love that we're both riding with our alma maters, despite the... It's been at times a rough year for both of our clubs, and here we are picking them to hold on. If we're picking them to what's the semifinal matchups that we'd be having a result is? We'd be saying Guelph. I'd be saying Guelph would be going to Laurier, and you'd be saying that Mac would be going
back to Windsor.
Back to Windsor. Okay. Interesting nonetheless. Again, as Tom said, we're going to be in the house at Richardson Stadium for that game. These are all 1:00 games. Hopefully you're in the region. You can come out to some of these games. If you're in Kingston, obviously come say what's up. Tom, let's take our talents around the league and look at the rest of the action on the USports calendar. This is, of course, the final week of action for the remaining 3 conferences. And it starts off on a Friday afternoon. Hailing from Saskatchewan, the Regina Rams hosting the UBC Thunderbirds. And then an amazing nightcap coming out of Halifax, the Huskies of St. Mary's hosting St. FX, 7 p.m. Atlantic time. Then on the Saturday, we got Acadia going to Bishops, Laval going to Sherbrooke, Concordia at McGill, Alberta at Calgary, a rematch of the Battle of Alberta, and Manitoba taking on what possibly will still be an Anton Ammanrud-less Saskatchewan Huskies club. Tom, where do you want to start with these matchups?
Well, let's go. I love me some Can West football. Let's start in the Can West. Uh, First off, a Friday afternoon game. Not something that I've ever seen before, but I like it. I'm definitely going to see if I can tune into it, although I do have a football game myself that I have to be up for at near that time. But when we saw Regina play against UBC, and when I say we saw, I directly saw. I was in the house for that game. This is really where we saw Noah Peltier really come alive. I mean, in that game, he finishes 25 for 33, 360 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. Marshall Erickson, 27 attempts, 196 yards on the ground and a touchdown. I think that this is a UBC squad that has certainly been reeling and not necessarily playing their best football. Just there's a lot of factors going into that, Drew Viotto and some injuries and things of that nature. I think coming to Regina is a tough matchup for these UBC Thunderbirds, but with Regina not 100% being confident, at least in which quarterback they want to start, I think having a slower start or not having that same level of chemistry right off the hop might benefit these UBC Thunderbirds. And especially with how Drew Viotto has been throwing the ball and what he's looking like, I think we'll see much more offense coming out of this one. Derek Engel was the quarterback last time for UBC, but I think Viotto being in there, going through his reads, and eventually just saying, you know what, everybody's covered, F it, I'm going to throw the ball up and see if Shamar McBean can come down with it, is probably going to be a game plan that could potentially work. I will still take the Regina Rams to win this one, though.
No, I'm in agreement with you there. And that would, of course, put UBC at 2-6 on the season. Now, they do have the tiebreaker versus Calgary. So let's take a look at Calgary's game quickly. The Battle of Alberta. They're hosting the Alberta Golden Bears in this matchup. Alberta, as we saw last week, going back to your guy in Eli Hetlinger. Calgary is still having this just strange season of incredibly high highs, some inconsistency, some turnovers at times, but the combination of David Jordan, Zion Grant on the offensive side being really strong for them, and with Alberta, obviously, whichever quarterback it's been in there, Carter Kettle as this go-to guy for them offensively being so strong. This is a game that if Calgary wins, they lock in the playoff destiny, and if they lose, well, then again, if even with the UBC loss, having lost to those Thunderbirds, I think it would knock them out. So it's a situation where, oddly enough, it's a bigger, like, I guess, like Calgary needs to win arguably more than UBC does at this point. It'd be a bigger upset for them to lose. What do you make of this matchup between the Dinos and the Golden Bears here?
Yeah, anytime you get into a battle, well, we like to say the Battle of Highway 6 or the Battle of Waterloo, whatever else, but when you got the Battle of Alberta going, you got two teams that are pretty well matched, I would say. This is going to be another great game. I mean, Calgary came away with the victory in their first meeting, 23-19, another close game. And I think Alberta has gotten a whole lot better since they last saw each other earlier in the season here. I really, from an Alberta standpoint, I'm hoping that Eli Hetlinger is the man at the helm here. I think he gives them a better chance, and especially the connection that he seems to have with Carter Kettle and how he's able to get him the ball, I think helps them out a whole lot. The one area that I have been interested in with this Alberta rushing attack is Opie Oshanubi. I mean, he was one of the fastest. I think he was the fastest guy at the CFL draft in the combine there. I haven't really seen a whole ton from him here. I'm not sure if he just doesn't fit the game plan quite right, or if something's been bugging him or what. But we'd be interested to see if he starts to really come out and starts to do his thing here. I really like the progression of David Jordan from the Calgary side. He, as a quarterback, has been really coming along well. And that Calgary defense, I think going into this season, even though Calgary had a lot of question marks around what they were going to be able to do, everybody from across the league had a good sense of that defense is going to be legit. And they played some pretty good football as well, being in tight games against everybody, regardless of who it is. So this is going to be a real tight one. I will not pick the Dinos. I will pick Alberta to come away with the win here just because I love me some Golden Bear football.
And again, I think that pick would then essentially be knocking the Dinos out. Tom, our final matchup, Sask hosting Manitoba. Of course, this is the matchup that saw Saskatchewan pick up their only loss of the season when they went out to Winnipeg earlier in the season. It was a game that saw Jackson Tuchinski throw both 3 touchdowns and throw 2 interceptions. Braden Stubbs break the century mark on the ground. And a game in which, for Manitoba, their destiny is locked in stone. That third place for them doesn't change one way or another. But for Saskatchewan, we know that for them being tied with their Giants 6-1, yes, they have the head-to-head, but obviously 6-2 versus 7-1 is an easy way to flip the script for those Rams. And we know that, well, sorry, I shouldn't say we know, but as we've been saying all year long, this feels like a Hardy Bowl that runs through the Battle of Saskatchewan, and having that home field advantage, well, maybe in some ways because they're so darn close, it doesn't matter all that much. It still feels like home in either spot, but a bigger game for Saskatchewan than it is for Manitoba from a seeding perspective, and a Manitoba team that can also come into this game being like, we beat these guys already. Like, what are we worried about in this one? We have nothing to lose, and these guys can lose first place on the year. What do you make of this matchup? Yeah, a loss for Sask earlier from Winnipeg, but now they get to play host.
I think this is going to be a real testament to how well Sask can play, even if Anton Amrud is not in. If it is Jake Farrell who's throwing the ball here, let's not forget in the previous matchup that they played, Sask scored of their 20 points, they scored 17 of them in the first half and then were held to just 3 in the second half. I mean, at halftime, it's 17-0 for Saskatchewan. And you and I are both thinking, wow, well, thanks for coming out, Manitoba. Like, this is going to be a tough one. And then Toba storms back and scores 21 points to make the final 21-20 here. And there's some heartbreaking antics at the very end. Sass trying to get into range, missing the field goal, all that stuff. But Manitoba, I think, is a good football team. This is very similar makeup to a team that went 7-1 last year and were number 1 in the Can West. But as we have found out pretty quickly here, it doesn't really matter how you finish because any team can beat anybody at any given time in the Can West, which is why it's some of the best football we have here. I will still take Saskatchewan to win this game, regardless of who is in at quarterback. I think they're going to be a little bit more polished than what they were in Manitoba, and hosting the Bisons at home helps a lot.
And I think as good as that Manitoba running attack has been, when it's your boy number 4, Hundaby, sitting in the middle waiting for them, spells disaster. Tom, let's head over to the RSCQ to take a look at the games happening there. The Montreal Carabins on the bye, having secured up their final standings at 6-2. We have Laval going to Sherbrooke. We have Concordia at McGill. For Laval, not that I'm going to spend too much time wondering about what happens if they lose to Sherbrooke and if they end up tied with Montreal, 6-2 apiece. And, the Montreal would have lost to McGill and Laval would have lost to Sherbrooke. I'm not going to pay that outcome too much attention. The one that I'm going to pass over to you is McGill versus Concordia, a game that we saw the Stingers pick up the win in earlier in the season, and where we're going to play off the assumption that Sherbrooke is going to be at 2-6 when it's all said and done, as will one of these other clubs. Sets up a tiebreak situation with Sherbrooke and one of the two between McGill and Concordia, a Concordia team that we saw have a really nice outing against the Vert et Or last week. What are you liking in that one with, again, how good that rushing attack's been for McGill?
So it is really important to point out that in the previous matchup that McGill played against Concordia, they did not have Jerry Momo running the ball in there. I believe he was injured for the first part of the season. So to have him into the lineup and really see what that rushing attack looks like, I think is going to be a better sense of how well this team can play. Now, even despite that, while ELR's completion percentage not great, he goes 20 for 42 in the air. He does finish with 309 yards of passing, 1 touchdown, and the 1 interception. So does show that capability that he has with his arm. And I think while he still will show what he can do in the air, having Jerry running the ball, and when ELR takes off and runs with it himself, they become a dynamic 1-2 punch that is very difficult to stop. Concordia has been going back and forth with who they'd want in at quarterback. For my money, I've seen Xavier Tremblay play pretty well, and I think I wouldn't be surprised to see him starting going into this one. He was the same guy who was playing against them earlier in this year, but they're going to need a big game from Frank Tchembe, their running back, and just alleviating some pressure off of whoever's in that quarterback for Concordia. But with that being said, with McGill's rushing attack, with how well they really look, I'm taking the Redbirds to win this game.
And I'll probably be in agreement with you. And I think if I have it right, that would then actually knock out Concordia, because in their 2 matchups with Sherbrooke, they're 1-1 apiece. And Concordia, sorry, do I have this right? Concordia in their win against Sherbrooke won by 4. That's the one we saw last week. And then, they lost by 13 when they lost to Sherbrooke. So that's a +9 in the point differential for the Vert et Or. So I think the way we have it would be with the Stingers missing the RCQ playoffs. But for all we know, like with those bottom 3 teams, McGill, Sherbrooke, and Concordia, it's been a merry-go-round. So for all we know, it would almost seem fitting. Unfortunately, though, it would be for McGill to end up being the one missing the big dance, just given what we've come to learn about this team, of being like the fact that they would have been the only team other than Laval to beat Montreal this whole year, and then for not to make the playoffs would be something very odd indeed. Let's finish off with the AUS. Mount Allison both got eliminated from the playoffs last week, and also their season ended literally and metaphorically, finishing at 1-7. Acadia going to Bishops, St. FX going to St. Mary's with first place on the line. With a St. FX win, it would have both teams ending up at 6-2. St. FX with both of those games against the Huskies, and obviously a St. Mary's win locks them in one way or the other. The question then, of course, would be, it's not really much of a question. A Bishop's win has them tied with St. FX at 5-3, and St. FX has taken out, they're tied 1-1 apiece. Mm-hmm. The first one, Fagnon was not in, Bishop's wins, and then St. FX took it to them. I don't remember the score in that first one, but with the beatdown St. FX put on Bishop's last week, I'm going to go ahead and say they're probably up in the point differential between the two clubs. In either case, Bishop's Acadia, St. FX, St. Mary's, these are the 4 playoff teams. The only real seeding change is between St. FX and St. Mary's. I think 3 and 4 with Bishops and Acadia are pretty locked in. What do you make out of the action in the Atlantic Conference?
Well, for Bishops, first off, I think ending off with a team in Acadia that has been struggling throughout the season here is honestly something of a blessing, because it gives them a chance to get back on the right track here and to really focus on getting back to form. I mean, we've seen a couple of pretty nasty losses from the Gators in this season so far, and we've talked about it a number of times, but how important it is to go into the playoffs on a positive note, and how well that you can really carry that momentum in there. Getting a good solid win against an Acadia squad that has been struggling, I think will help you a whole lot. Now with this St. FX St. Mary's squad, or this game, and this is a game, quite honest with you, that I am almost as excited to see than any other game on this slate, because I think this is going to be really outstanding. As a side note, well, you and I made a joke of like, hey, you want to like just grab a plane and get out to Halifax? I looked it up. Oh my God, it's like $700, $800 for a couple of days to get out to Halifax and back. So we will not be seeing you in Nova Scotia for this game, although one day you will definitely see us out there. But anyways, I digress. I'm really interested to see what this is going to turn out as. I mean, this is a St. Mary's defense that has showcased that they are legit numerous times and held St. FX to just 114 yards of total rushing and held Malcolm Bussey to just 60 yards on 12 attempts. Yeah, another 37 coming from Silas as he's taking off and running with it. So really tight in that rush defense. Silas Vagnon, once again, the completion percentage not exactly there. He finishes 19 for 38, 232 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 interception. But they do still pick up the win. Now, having to travel to Antigonish and then having to travel to Halifax, in the scope of things, in the scope of travel, is peanuts compared to what some of the other teams are playing against, but it does mean something. Going into Halifax and playing in front of a crowd that will be cheering for their Huskies, I think will add into this. But with how well St. FX looked in that win against Bishops last week, I will take the X-Men to get the dub and get back on top in the AUS for the first time in a little while.
I mean, that's huge because these teams played in a preseason game as well, also in Antigonish, that St. FX came out on top of. So, for Bishops, again, I'm with you. They probably almost certainly picking up the win against Acadia, locking in the 3rd spot. Whether it's Halifax or Antigonish, I don't like their chances having to go on the road in the first round of the playoffs. But my goodness, if St. FX pulls off the win in Halifax, setting up a home Loney Bowl against, like, the idea that it would be the 4th matchup. On the one hand, if it's hard to beat a team twice, it's that much harder to beat a team thrice. To beat a team 4 times, my goodness, would that ever be a challenge, especially given how dominant St. Mary's has been against literally everyone else. Vagnon and his St. FX crew are just the kryptonite to this team. This is like the same way that we kind of talked about Western. This is the equivalent of the Western Laurier. This is Western Laurier of the AUS right now, not just from the standpoint of the top 2 teams competing for first, but it just has that feeling of, well, clearly if you're the first ranked team, you should be the favorite within your conference to win it all. But it just goes deeper than that based on how this matchup's gone. I love the take from you. Man, Shibley, let's see you come to work, man. You put up some good points against everybody else. He does get his own against St. FX, so I shouldn't just lay it all at the feet of Justin Shibley. But my goodness, if they follow them for the 3rd time, then I think we are getting the X-Men back into the national semifinals. But we are a long ways away from that. Tom, I think we should call that a wrap. If for no other reason, because if we go any longer, I'm going to fall asleep on the podcast. Final thoughts on the first round of playoffs in the OUA and the final week of the regular season in our other 3 conferences.
Well, first and foremost, you're a stud for coming on and doing the podcast so late into the night after such a big game and a big win for you and your squad. So I appreciate you as always, my man.
Well, coming from the first place ranked Crusaders as well. So I'll take that as a high compliment from you, my friend.
Appreciate you. The last thing that I'll say, in some weird scenario here, there is actually a way for Montreal to finish first in the RSEQ. First, Sherbrooke has to win against Laval.
Okay, so then let's just
which is a big. But Sherbrooke also has to score 22 points in that game. They don't need to
Stop it.
win by 22. As long as they score 22 and they win by 1 point, then Montreal would finish first. So there is a crazy scenario. No, it's not going to happen. Laval's finishing first. I just thought that was a hilarious thing that was so specific. Even in the matchup, I was rewatching the Laval Montreal game on the TVA stream. Somebody posted it on YouTube, and they're going through, okay, if Montreal wins, then they get first place. If Laval wins by more than 11 points, then they get it. If they lose by, if they win by only 9 points, then there's another scenario here. If they win exactly by 10 points, which is what they did, then it got into this Sherbrooke scenario where if they scored 22, I just thought that was hilarious. And if anything else, that should give all of our listeners a little bit of grace to us when we're trying to figure out playoff scenarios, and they can get so minute into, yeah, if he scores this point here, if he kicked a field goal on the 40-yard line, then that could mean all of that stuff. But anyways, in the OUA at least, we don't have to worry about that anymore. We've set up these games beautifully. I am so excited to watch all of them. And again, to get to do it in person with you, my man, is something that I will never take for granted. You stud.
Right back at you, my friend. I'm so excited for the weekend in Kingston. I'm so excited to see if our predictions on picking our alma maters, underdogs though they may be, come to fruition. Can you imagine an at the 55 bowl Yates Cup? It's been, 11 years since we've had one. I don't think this is the year for it, but can you imagine the action out east, the action out west, the RSEQ? Let's see what happens in that championship game. I can't wait for that to occur. And of course, we'll be breaking all of it and so much more down for you later on this week, right here at the 55.